Hi, this is Professor Favors with American Literature. So today's topic is on Nella Larsen's Sanctuary. And Larsen's work is part of Modernism and add to it Harlem Renaissance. This particular presentation lecture includes scholarly perspectives and MLA formatting examples. So this is American Literature, Nella Larsen's Sanctuary. This lecture is subject to fair use. So let's look at literary criticism for sanctuary because you do have to apply a scholarly perspective. So first, we're going to look at plagiarism accusations, exploring the different strategies. So two critical works, journal articles for sanctuary. The following critical works explore the concept of plagiarism. So the first discussion is your first application. The reason why Love and Theft, Plagiarism, Blackface, and Nella Larsen Sanctuary is your first scholarly perspective that you add is because this particular source references the literary work. The second discussion, which is a secondary application, plagiarism and unethical practices in literature, this source is a source on the topic of plagiarism. So you don't apply it you don't apply it to Nella Larsen's work before you apply the first source that actually references plagiarism. One is a support for the other. All right, so let's look at love and theft first, understanding intertextuality, Barbara Hochman's critiques. So let's define intertextuality. It is defined as the relationship between texts, especially literary ones. It is the act of one text referencing, quoting, and or alluding to another text. It reveals interconnectedness between texts, how meaning in one text is shaped or influenced by its relationship with other texts. All right, so let's look at an example of um, how intertextuality is applied. So let's introduce the source. Hochman suggests that there is intertextuality between Nella Larsen's Sanctuary, Sheila K. Smith's Mrs. Addis, and Edith Wharton's Sanctuary. K. Smith writes Mrs. Addis from the perspective of British class consciousness. Larsen writes Sanctuary from the perspective of mimicking African American race loyalty. Wharton writes Sanctuary from the perspective of highlighting artistic imitation and intellectual theft. Hochman believes Larsen's work is a rewrite of K. Smith's work and that Wharton's work anticipates Larsen's plagiarism or intellectual theft of K. Smith. So is you defining the relationship between texts. In this case, Barbara Hochman of Love and Theft is suggesting plagiarism is sort of like the link between the texts, whether it's explicit or implicit. So introducing Love and Theft, plagiarism, blackface, and Nella Larsen's Sanctuary, first mention. So now we are creating a first mention. So you'll see there's a section of this lecture that goes into the MLA formatting just in general as separate. And then there are aspects of it within the lecture, within this section also where we go into it. So Barbara Hochman in Love and Theft, Plagiarism, Blackface, and Nella Larsen's Sanctuary suggests that there is intertextuality between Nella Larsen's Sanctuary, Sheila K. Smith's Mrs. Addis, and Edith Wharton's Sanctuary. K. Smith writes Mrs. Addis from the perspective of British class consciousness. Larsen writes Sanctuary from the perspective of mimicking African American race loyalty. Wharton writes Sanctuary from the perspective of highlighting artistic imitation and intellectual theft using a central character plagued with a dilemma to plagiarize or not to plagiarize. Hochman argues Larsen's work is a rewrite of K. Smith's work and that Wharton's work anticipates Larsen's plagiarism, artistic imitation, and intellectual theft. So I wanted to just sort of recap the previous slide so that you can see the full first mention example. Love and Theft, similar plots, quoting. So Hochman references three authors in the journal article and explores their intertextuality. So we're looking at the journal article and just making sure that we get an understanding of uh, how the author, Hockman, is outlining her argument. So first, Nella Larsen is critique of race relations and group allegiance. Sheila K. Smith, British class loyalty. Edith Wharton, artistic imitation and intellectual theft, moral consciousness. So this is what's going on in Hockman's view, or this is how Hockman is presenting these three authors. Larsen and K. Smith's tales center on a woman who harbors a runaway thief in her house. The man has killed someone while fleeing his pursuers. At the end of the story, the woman realizes the victim is her son, but does not expose the killer. So this is what is going on in both Larsen's Sanctuary and K. Smith's Mrs. Addis work, that Hockman is suggesting that Larsen rewrote aspects of Kay Smith's work, um, where she looks at British class loyalty and Larsen looks at uh, race relations and group allegiance. Love and Theft, Hockman applying Wharton to Larsen. So when within a scholarly work, a scholarly journal article, you have the main author, researcher Hockman, sort of exploring maybe a literature review of Larsen's work or just other scholarly perspectives. But because she wants to look at Wharton's representation or depiction of the moral dilemma about plagiarism, and apply it to Larsen, she has to explore it. So Hockman discusses the implications of professional plagiarism. Wharton's novella traces a character's temptation to commit plagiarism and ends with his triumphant decision not to do so. Thus, while Larsen's Sanctuary reproduces many aspects of Mrs. Addis, its title references a story that addresses the meaning of artistic imitation and intellectual theft. Wharton's novella almost uncannily anticipates or more precisely reverses key aspects of Larsen's personal history and career trajectory. This suggests that Wharton foreshadows, albeit inadvertently, Larsen's professional decision to plagiarize when forced with the moral dilemma to plagiarize or not to plagiarize. Hockman's argument does not suggest that Wharton personally believed Larsen plagiarized. Although Wharton doesn't directly address Larsen's work in her book, Hockman sees Wharton's novella as a revealing gloss on Larsen's Sanctuary, not only because Wharton's plot centers on plagiarism, but because it affirms the importance of talent, persistence, and strength of character in becoming a successful professional. By applying Wharton, Hockman affirms her belief about Larsen plagiarizing Kate Smith's work. So the follow-up statement, the follow-up statement is here. This suggests that Wharton foreshadows, albeit inadvertently, all the way down to here. And then there is another follow-up statement. It's important to do follow-up statements after quoting. Do not just leave the quote to itself, but make sure to analyze the quote, what is being suggested about the quote, and then go into some sort of analysis. You could explain the quote and then analyze it. And then if you're going to incorporate another quote, as we see here, don't forget to follow it up. So Hockman applying Wharton, Hockman is trying to give her assessment of Larsen's work as being a rewrite of Sheila K. Smith's work, um, some kind of merit. If she can apply Wharton, whose work is about intellectual theft, to Larsen's rewrite or reworking of Sheila K. Smith's work, then she has a a substantial argument for accusing Larsen of plagiarizing Sheila K. work or Mrs. Addison. Okay, so that's her way of applying. Don't forget, know the difference between when Hockman is speaking. She's discussing the implications of professional plagiarism, and then she goes into how a summary of Warden's novella tracing a character's temptation to commit plagiarism and ends with a triumphant decision not to do so. This is still her summarizing Warden, but it's still Warden's work. Um, and then when she's trying to apply Warden to Larsen, here where she says or writes, Ward's novella almost uncannily anticipates key aspects of Lorden's personal history and career trajectory. I think Warden's work was published in 1903, if I have that right, and Larsen's work was published, I think, 1929 or 1930, something like that. And so she's suggesting that Warden had some sort of foreshadowing insight into Larsen's work that she was going to plagiarize Sheila K. Smith. That she's giving Warden more credence and more merit about being sort of like this foreshadowing figure of who's going to plagiarize and who's not going to plagiarize. So that's Hockman applying Warden to Larsen. All right, love and theft, class consciousness and irony, quoting, and then your follow-up statement. So Hockman comparing Wharton and Larsen. All right, when Wharton struck out for herself as a writer, she refused the conventional script according to which a woman derives legitimacy and personal identity by virtue of being first a respectable man's daughter, then a wife and mother. So that's her assessment of Wharton. Hockman's assessment of Wharton. And then in Larsen's case, the liability of gender was compounded by her mixed race origins, working class background, and possible birth out of wedlock. By 1930, she understood that literacy, artistic talent, and determination would not enable her to rise above her origins as Wharton did. So even in just presenting Larsen, she can't really present Larsen without bringing in Wharton. Warden is one type of writer, Larsen is another type of writer, but she wants to compare the two because she has a different agenda. So Hockman's criticism, using blackface strategies of mimicry and mockery, Larsen's last story subtly but caustically ironizes the values endorsed by Wharton's novella and K. Smith's tale. And so here is your follow-up statement. Hockman continues to affirm her belief that Larsen plagiarized K. Smith's work and uses both the class backgrounds of Warden and K. Smith to explore Larsen's moral dilemma. Warden is a white woman uh, from a background where she actually had an in-house library. Kay Smith is a white woman, but she's British, and so she is connecting. Even though she gives race here, mixed race origins, it's more along the lines of connecting their class backgrounds. Really, this is really about class more than it is about race. All right, Love and Theft, Hockman's assessment of Larsen. So now we're going to learn about indirect citation. We're quoting and we're still, we need to reference sources that we did not read. So when you quote from a source that references sources for which you did not read, you must tell the reader that you did not read that source by using quoted in, qtd.in, before the citation. Here is an example of source material. Quotation marks have not been applied, so this is on purpose. So in Sanctuary, Larsen abandons her former focus on articulate, educated, mixed race characters to depict Black failure, dialect, and violence in the rural South. Recent scholars have suggested that this shift of style and subject matter signals Larsen's alliance with Harlem Renaissance representations of the folk and implies an affirmation of race solidarity. So Hockman is quoting or referencing a source that she got this information from. Holler, 2006, on these pages, and Godfrey, 2013, on these pages. Okay, so that means that Hockman read this material, but we did not. I suggest instead that for her last piece of fiction, Larsen blackens up to ironize racial allegiance and the very practices of appropriation and imitation she employs. So when we represent a source that we did not read, but the author is referencing an entry, we place before it quoted in. The Hockman's assessment of Larsen is very critical in a sense that why does she depart from the articulate, educated, mixed race characters um, that Larsen created for Quicksand and Passing to now depicting Black failure and dialect and violence in the rural South. That's her assessment of Larsen's strategy. Now, the more that she gives attention to Larsen's strategy, it's very interesting that she still believes that she rewrote or adapted Sheila K. Smith's work. So that's something to think about. Love and Theft, Hockman's assessment of Larsen. So we're now looking at how to quote the quoting aspect, how to double versus single quotation marks. So when something already has quotation marks around it in the work, and then when you want to quote, the information that's in double quotation marks in the original will become single quotation marks. So apply double quotation marks to quote and single quotation marks around material quoted, the author is quoting, to show the reader when you're quoting and when you're quoting what the author is quoting. So here's the original. In Sanctuary, Larsen abandons her former focus on articulate, educated, mixed race characters to depict Black failure, dialect, and violence in the rural South. Recent scholars have suggested that this shift of style and subject matter signals Larsen's alliance with Harlem Renaissance representations of the folk and implies an affirmation of race solidarity. I suggest instead that for her last piece of fiction, Larsen blackens up to ironize racial allegiance and the very practices of appropriation and imitation she employs. So the original work here that you see here has double quotation marks. Okay, the double quotation marks. Okay, and I'm not quoting here. I have not added any quotation marks myself, and there are double quotation marks for blackens up. Okay, let's see if there are any other. Okay, when we decide we want to quote, however, we have to add double quotation marks as you see here. Okay, these are double quotation marks as you see here. Get that out. Okay, try this. You have double quotation marks here, and so the original um, source material had sanctuary in double quotation marks. They become single in your quote. Okay. Don't forget the indirect citation quoted in. And then blackens up, which was originally double quotation marks, would would be treated as single. And then don't forget the name of the author and the page number you get the information from. So when we begin the line with the name of the author, we just need the page number. But if we do not reference the author's name when we introduce a quote or anywhere within this information here, this quoted information here, then we add the name of the author here, Hockman 511. And so don't forget the end quotation marks as well. Love and Theft, three narratives plus Hockman's criticism. So Larsen's Sanctuary is in many ways a straightforward rewrite of K. Smith's text. Both tales center on a woman who harbors a runaway thief in her house. The man has killed someone while fleeing his pursuers. At the end of the story, the woman realizes that the victim is her son, but she does not expose the killer. So this is Hockman's way of presenting both texts. And suggesting that Larsen has rewritten K. Smith's text. The above quote is a separate activity, but the following combines 2 pages. Note the use of ellipses and quoted here. And so we quoted here, and we're still quoting now. So in Wharton's Sanctuary, Dick Payton is tempted to submit someone else's work to an architectural competition. His impulse to plagiarize is presented as part of his biological makeup, the result of inherited tendencies, bequeathed to him by his morally dubious father. In the novella's denouement, the aesthetic and ethical commitments of a devoted mother prevent Dick from committing his crime. Annie Poole, the mother in Larsen's story, has raised her son to be upright, generous, and industrious, but she cannot save him from a violent end. Larsen reworks K. Smith's story to expose group solidarity as a pitiful substitute for autonomy, not only a weak fallback position, but segregation in another um, guise. The interesting thing about using segregation um, as a way to criticize Annie Poole's decision to be race loyal is ironic because segregation, separate but equal accommodations, Jim Crow laws were still um, in effect. So why criticize something that she has to maintain anyway? Now, the moral dilemma is in turning someone in, whether or not that person, whether or not each party falls under Jim Crow law. Annie Poole should have turned in Jim Hammer. However, to criticize um, Annie Poole for being race loyal in a era where anybody who was perceived as killing a white man or doing something to a white person could be hanged or shot or arrested is sort of a little bit biased. Segregation worked more for white people than it did for black people. Black people had to be segregated, so they couldn't go into the white cars, but white people could still go into the cars where black people were. So it's not to me, it's not segregation in another guise because that's what was going on at that time. I think Hockman's views of Larsen's work is a bit biased, especially given the fact that K. Smith's work also focuses on um, sort of loyalty as well. So think about she references Wharton in her work Hockman, so you still have to do a quoted in because you did not read Wharton's work. And then, of course, we are also quoting. All right, Hockman's comparative assessment of plots, so quoting and then paraphrasing. So, Wharton's Sanctuary, the main character, Dick Payton, through his mother's appeals, resists the temptation to plagiarize and is redeemed from his inherited tendencies. Wharton's plagiarism plot explores questions of authenticity, talent, and biological determinism that consistently plague Larsen. Could she succeed as an artist? To what extent was her biological inheritance, her mixed race origin, a liability? Larsen was preoccupied with doubts about her authenticity and originality being relegated to merely imitating white practices. So this is paraphrasing because it's very close to the original, and this is paraphrasing because it's also close to the original, but it's not quoting as we do here. This is actually a quote. So again, this is summarizing what Hockman has summarized of Wharton's work. This is summarizing Hockman's views of Larsen. Larsen's Sanctuary. So Larsen's plot explores a mother who is helpless to save her son, who has already been killed. When we read the narrative, the mother just just doesn't know that Jim Hammer has killed her son. The tale demonstrates that being honest, hardworking, and educated, or skilled, and a mighty fine boy like the murder victim Obadiah has limited value in a world of racialized binaries. Signifying on Warden's sanctuary, Larsen exposes the limits of the moral and aesthetic values that Warden novella affirms. I kind of think that comparing these two plots between Warden's sanctuary and Larsen's sanctuary is a bit imbalanced. Uh, but I think I see the strategy where Hockman is looking at Warden's dictating and his moral dilemma and his decision to plagiarize or not to plagiarize. And when he doesn't plagiarize, it benefits him. And there's this focus on authenticity and talent, biological determinism. However, Obadiah is a mighty fine boy and he becomes a murder victim, but there isn't a discussion about how there isn't a true discussion about his authenticity. Uh, Mighty fine boy can be just a perception. His mother calls him a mighty fine boy, right? Or the law enforcement calls him a mighty fine boy, but that doesn't necessarily suggest that both these works, just because Larson decided to name her work, her short story, Sanctuary, and just because Warden's book is a novella is Sanctuary, doesn't mean that Larson is guilty of plagiarism just because Wharton's plot is about plagiarism. It's about moral dilemma. So if you focus more so on the moral dilemma, then you can see the mother or Dick Payton and Annie Poole and Jim Hammer faced with a moral dilemma. But to focus on this aspect of plagiarism and suggest that because Larson names her short story Sanctuary, and it must have been because she wanted to copy Wharton's Sanctuary, um, and the plot or whatever is implied because she decided to copy, use the title Sanctuary. She's suggesting that Wharton ideal about plagiarism as a plot within her work is some sort of foreshadowing of Larson uh, plagiarizing Sheila K. Smith's work. I don't think these two plots work, but they're just kind of interesting for right now. Love and Theft, Hockman's bases for Larson's doubts. So in Sanctuary, Larson departs, and we're paraphrasing. In Sanctuary, Larson departs from previous strategies that presented characters as articulate and educated to representing characters as examples of Black failure using dialect and Southern violence. So anytime you have work that's kind of close to the original that the author is writing, you always it's either a direct quoting activity or you add a citation for a paraphrase. Larson uses sanctuary to blacken up racial allegiance by utilizing a form of minstrelsy in which characters reflect an imitation of blackface. Larson initially began her career as a nurse and then became the first African American to earn a library school diploma. During her time working at the Harlem Library branch, she decided to become a professional author, hoping that in becoming an author, she could move out of her current racially marginalized position and family background and move into artistic production. Larson's background is available online. We can find information about it. However, the choice of words here come from Hockman. uh, what she particularly calls attention to. And since you can find some aspect of this paraphrase in her work, we need to add a citation at the end. Other than that, it's fine. So this is Hockman's bases for Larson's doubts. Larson wanted to become. She was a librarian, nurse, and she wanted to become an author, and she is situated during the Harlem Renaissance. What I think with some people is when they decide to shift careers, I think it has a lot to do with wanting to be accepted, wanting to be noticed, wanting to come to the forefront, wanting to seek something where, in her case, that she's not perceived as the the African American in the group. She joins Harlem Renaissance and becomes a writer, wanting to become a professional author so that she can be accepted without necessarily having to call attention to uh, her cultural ethnic ancestry, right? And so this is what Hockman is saying about Larsen, that she shifts from the way that she normally presented characters in two of her novels, Quicksand and Passing, to now uh, focusing on something that is completely different for her, especially in terms of the use of dialect. If you're not necessarily used to that type of dialect, her mother was a Danish mother, her father was Caribbean. So and she was exposed to different cultures and ancestries. So the southern world, the southern area is not something that she would normally be affiliated with. Now she did end up having to go to Fisk University because of segregation reasons, right? But it's still departing from something that she's used to writing to now trying to get into another realm of uh, genre and subgenre is a bit suspect. I do have to agree with Hockman here. And so what the motivation was, well, what to become a professional author, I think there's missing some other aspects of why she decided to do that. All right, so love and theft, problems with Hockman's assessment of Larsen's sanctuary. So this is, I want to sort of go over this. So there's a lot of alluding to versus Hockman declaring. So Hockman's assumptions that Larsen's sanctuary plagiarized K. Smith's Miss Addis. Let's understand. Let's get an understanding of what the difference is between allude and declare. So allude is to suggest, call attention to, mention without discussing at length, hint at. Declare is to say something in a solemn, emphatic manner, proclaim, state in an explicit way. So, as Thomas Malon notes, adapting a source without directly alluding to it has been the sine qua non in definitions of plagiarism since Samuel Johnson. Larsen's final story does not allude to Mrs. Addis, but in reproducing Wharton's title, it gives a text that is vulnerable to charges of plagiarism, the name of a novella that centers on the temptation to plagiarize. Since K. Smith's fiction, like Wharton, was extremely popular and much discussed in the 1920s, it is almost as if Larsen were announcing her violation of common assumptions about fair use of others' texts and staging her own literary suicide. In phrase, um, Beverly Haviland's phrase. However, as Jeffrey Sanborn suggests, plagiarism always involves a component of brinksmanship. In that spirit, I argue that Larsen's sanctuary damns many of the values she once believed in, as well as few she had never accepted. So I'm not formatting here. I'm not MLA formatting here. So this is just a direct quote. So if you decide to add this quote to your paper, make sure to add the quotation marks and make any changes thereof. But again, what I believe that Hockman is doing is trying to conflate um, two different strategies. She's saying that Larsen's final story, Sanctuary, does not allude, it does not discuss at length Mrs. Addis's work. But just because Larsen decided to use the title Sanctuary, which is a title of Wharton's novella, that it makes her vulnerable to charges of plagiarizing. So which one is Larsen plagiarizing? Is she plagiarizing Wharton's work or is she plagiarizing Sheila K. Smith's work? And so it's vulnerability to plagiarism, but that's only in the views of Hockman because one is about British class consciousness, Mrs. Addis, and the other is about racial allegiance, racial loyalty, group dynamics, group allegiance, which is Larsen's work. These are two different types of plots. Yes, there is a plot where a mother finds out that the killer is someone that she's harboring, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are the same works. Hockman's assessment is flawed. So the author's explanation, folkloric tradition has merit. All right, so Larsen had to write an author's explanation. She was being charged with plagiarizing another person's work. Readers looked at Larsen's work and thought it was similar to Sheila K. Smith. And so through the publisher, she had to write and print an author's explanation. So here it is. In an author's explanation printed directly below Leach's comments, Larsen insists she never read Mrs. Addis, but she avoids the issue of originality and foregrounds her own black racial identity. So Larsen's explanation draws attention to her race by claiming that her tale derives from an account she had heard years before while working as a hospital nurse. An old Negro woman told her the story, she explains. The woman presented its events as if they had happened to her personally. The patient told Larsen the story because she was distressed about race relations in a hospital where all the white doctors and executives dealt with infractions of rules by interrogating the black patients and nurses. We Negro nurses often had to tell things about each other to the white people, Larsen writes, citing the woman's conviction that if the Negro race would only stick together, we might get somewhere someday. So that's her author's explanation. And again, it's not MLA formatted. So what she is suggesting that she's pointing to folklore as the basis and source of information for writing Sanctuary. And we're going to see in a little bit that Sheila K. Smith also points to uh, source information that is reminiscent of folklore. And what this basically suggests is that Hockman's assessment of Larsen and suggesting that she rewrote Sheila K. Smith's work as a form of plagiarizing when applying Warden's plot in her work titled Sanctuary is flawed because folklore does have some sort of merit in the sense that we get our stories from somewhere. Maybe she did not, maybe she did avoid the issue of originality and look more at her racial identity, but that's her experience. Um, it could, I will challenge this ideal. If her father left the family early when she was young, what black identity is she used to? Because she was around um, her Danish mother, and her Danish mother remarried another Dane, a Danish man. So the only time that she might have been exposed to black racial identity is when she went to Fisk University. And so, where did she get this information? Still is a bit challenging because a lot of these stories, with her being considered a Negro woman, even as a biracial woman, it is possible that she came across the old Negro woman who told her about these stories and told her that we need to stick together in terms of racial allegiance and things like that. So it's definitely possible that she heard this, but Hockman really discounts Larsen's explanation as being nothing more than trying to find something to back up her strategy. She doesn't really believe it. Hockman's assessment is not balanced. So Sheila K. Smith's source of inspiration for Mrs. Addis. This reading gained support from Sheila K. Smith's memoir, All the Books of My Life, where she acknowledges her own source for Mrs. Addis. It is, to St. Francis, I owe the substance of a most successful short story, In the Spirit of St. Francis de Sales by John Pierre Camus. The saint tells how a mother whose son had been murdered stretched Christian charity and forgiveness to the point of sheltering his unwitting murderer. In his case, the setting was Italian, but its transfer to the Kent and Sussex borders is about the only change I made. St. Francis' tale bears no trace of the group loyalty issue. In this version of the story, the young man's death is the unforeseen result of a mad prank, not a robbery. But Sheila K. Smith is telling her that the only thing she changed was the borders. This happened in Italy, but she changed it to Kent and Sussex, and Hockman does not criticize this. That's why I say it's not balanced. If you're going to suggest that Larsen's explanation is not a sound one and that she's just reaching for some sort of racial identification, then you need to say the same thing about Sheila K. Smith. If folklore has no merit, then for Larsen, then it doesn't have any merit for Sheila K. Smith as well. So that's why I say it's not balanced. Hockman's biased assessment is based on racial biases. Claims that black authors imitate white practices. So Larsen's painstakingly acquired cultural competence was no match for the ease and security of born readers like Wharton. As Wharton's authorial ambitions took shape, gendered obstacles hampered her, but she was white and to the manner born. The essentialist claim that African Americans would never do more than imitate white behavior was enforced by the assumption that Negro blood would always reassert itself despite the most civilized accomplishments. As Helene Margaret puts it, writing in the Forum of 1932, at the moment of his success, the Negro savage blood is expected to run warm and he be capable at the least provocation of performing any antics of the jungle. Although to my knowledge no one said so in public at the time, Larsen's use of Mrs. Addis could easily have been taken as evidence of racial inferiority, the very sort of failure Rose believed had to be avoided if African Americans were to advance. So she's suggesting that Larsen copied or white writers, white behavior, imitated white behaviors because of her own racial inferiority. So she felt compelled to plagiarize, or she felt compelled to copy or imitate someone else. But as we just read, Sheila K. Smith copied somebody else and just changed the whole geography. She copied exactly someone else's narrative. Larsen used source of inspiration from folklore. So why would one person be considered racially inferior if both people that Hockman is using are copying or using as source material folklore? So that's why I say that her assessment is biased and it's based upon racial biases, meaning that she's using this ideal that African Americans are would never do more than imitate white behavior as some sort of support for the idea that Larsen reworked um, Mrs. Addis or Sheila K. Smith's work. But African Americans are more than capable of creating their own work. If you have a few, you may have a few outliers, but most of the Harlem Renaissance writers, artists, visual artists, painters, poets, novelists, they wrote their own work, and so I think her assessment is biased. So let's define plagiarism now that we have already looked at the primary work, which was Love and Theft by Barbara Hockman. We're going to look at how to apply plagiarism and unethical practices in literature. That's your second source. We're also looking at some MLA formatting too. So defining plagiarism, quoting plus MLA formatting. So Rajesh Sinha, Gurnarinda Singh, and Chandrasekhar Kumar define plagiarism within their journal article titled Plagiarism and Unethical Practices in Literature as the unauthorized use or close imitation of the language and thoughts of another author and the representation of them as one's own original work. So we have the full title with full names and full title. The authors provide a literature review of key terms, types of plagiarism in specific health professions, context, ideal stealing, ethical considerations, and misconduct. Sinha et al. So once we have provided the full names. We only need to refer to them in et al. Sinha et al. Explored specifically how plagiarism can ruin someone's career, causing that person to be forced to leave their profession. For example, in referencing the entry Caval, the authors explore a Norway doctor who admitted to fabricating results in a medical journal. The researcher, duly qualified in dentistry and medicine, immediately admitted fabricating the results. As a result, the researcher lost his authorization to practice medicine and dentistry. The authors suggest that more attention should be given to the peer review process. So this is basically introducing this source, just giving a rundown. It's about 5-6 pages or so, and so figuring out which one of the entries. It works kind of like an annotated bibliography, but it's more along the lines of a literature review on the topic of plagiarism in the health professions. And so one of the entries is on Conval. So uh, remember that full names, including first and last name, full full title of work, formatted in quotation marks. And then when we do not begin the sentence, uh, if we begin the sentence with the names, we don't need the names here. And once we have introduced them, we can do an abbreviated form of their name, of the authors. Um, and then um, and then even in a citation, sent out et al. 484, because when we go to the works cited page, we'll see the full names of the authors. So plagiarism key terms, so key factors: represent work without changing the data, represent work as one's own, represent work as falsified, represent work as fabricated, represent work as reused text, represent work as forced data, and then represent work as peer reviewed. So these are key factors. It's always important that you understand what plagiarism actually is. And so if you are representing work without changing the data, meaning that you're copying someone else's data, it just depends on what type of data it is, especially when the data is in the methodology section. If you are creating the new methodology, then of course you need a you would have new data. But if you are conducting a literature review of previously created data, you can do that in the methodology section, but you do have to call attention to the fact that this type of data is coming or being adapted or coming from somewhere else. A lot of times people tend to represent a work as their own or falsified or fabricated. Reused text does depend on who's the owner of that text. If you want to reuse some aspects of something that you put in one book and put it in another book and you're not with the publisher, you're just self-publishing, you can do that without any issues. It's always a good idea to say, hey, this material is adapted from, and then you insert the title. And then force data, represent work that's been peer reviewed. Anytime something that's been peer reviewed has gone through a lengthy process with experts in the field. But if the experts in the field are compromised, then your results may look compromised as well. So let's look at the falsification, the types: falsification, fabrication. There's another type that I go over in the next slide, which is double publication. So falsification: represent work by omitting or altering use of research tools, which include data processing and equipment, to the point that the research results do not accurately reflect the research. And then fabrication: represent the practice of inventing results and recording them in the research record. So it just depends on what you're doing. If you take a piece of text and it's either going to be a direct quote from the original source, or it's going to be a paraphrase and you add a citation from the original source. But if you change that quote so much to the point that it loses its meaning, it's not going to reflect the actual method and the initial purpose and goal of that research. That's why when you are applying any brackets or any ellipses, you don't change too much of the meaning of the quote, so that when someone has to go back and research it, they'll find exactly the meaning that you have in your paper. So applying plagiarism and unethical practices in literature to Hockman's Love and Theft. So remember, Hockman is your primary scholarly perspective because Hockman is the one who is exploring Larsen's work, not plagiarizing. I mean, not plagiarism and unethical practices. So Larsen's Sanctuary is in many ways a straightforward rewrite of K. Smith's text. Both tales center on a woman who harbors a runaway thief in her house. The man has killed someone while fleeing his pursuers. Larsen reworks K. Smith's story to expose group solidarity as a pitiful substitute for autonomy, not only a weak fallback position, but segregation in another guise. Larsen's final story does not allude to Mrs. Addis, but in reproducing Wharton's title, it gives a text that is vulnerable to charges of plagiarism, the name of a novella that centers on the temptation to plagiarize, which suggests that plagiarism always involves a component of brickmanship. So these are three quotes from Hockman's work to look at. So when you're thinking about applying a secondary scholarly perspective, think about the quotes that you want to use. So these are three. This is the first one, the second one, and the third one. So in Plagiarism and Unethical Practices in Literature, Sinha et al., the authors um, they discuss double publication. So when you're reading that secondary source and you're trying to figure out which information can I apply to which text, here's one. Hockman is likely accusing Larsen of double publication, which Sinha et al. Define as a practice which involves repeat publication or attempts at publication of text, figures, or data in any form of publicly available media without citation in a later transcript or manuscript. The traditional definition of plagiarism also works on unauthorized use or imitation of language and thoughts of another author in one's work. So you could use what Sinha et al. Say about double publication because Hockman notes in her work that Larsen was aware of Sheila K. Smith's work uh, and and Warden as well, but she was aware of it because I think it came out before 1929 or something like that, before Larsen's work. And so part of this definition in terms of Hockman saying that Larsen reworks or rewrites K. Smith's text, but just adds the racial component to it, versus in Sheila K. Smith's work is the class consciousness component to it. It could be accused of double publication, that in any form of publicly available media without citation in the later manuscript. What they are suggesting in Hockman's work is that all Larsen had to do was write that this material is adapted from wherever it is from, and that would have closed the gap in understanding about plagiarizing the work. So these are my thoughts on the plagiarism accusation. So issue number one, Hockman bases a plagiarism accusation for Larsen's Sanctuary on another author's work titled the same Sanctuary. Just because the latter work focuses on plagiarism, the character's moral dilemma, does not mean that Larsen's work is considered plagiarizing Sheila K. Smith's Mrs. Addis. That's my issue. Issue number two, Hockman uses other scholarship that references the word plagiarism to support her assumptions about Larsen, but she does not directly argue Larsen plagiarized Mrs. Addis. So she does this sort of roundabout way of accusing Larsen of plagiarizing using the words rework and rewrite, but she doesn't use the word plagiarize. What she does is she uses scholarship that discusses plagiarism and applies it within her argument to suggest that Larsen plagiarized Mrs. Addis. Issue number three, Hockman makes a good case for arguing that Larsen departs from a traditional way of representing characters from her previous two works, Quicksand and Passing, in terms of language, dialect, and characterization to blackface mimicry as a biracial author who grew up under both European and Caribbean influences in Sanctuary. Larsen's perception of Southern dialect as depicted may be biased because if you didn't grow up around the South, you didn't grow up. In other words, she didn't grow up like Booker T. Washington, who grew up off a plantation, who would understand certain types of Southern dialect. Larsen is trying to um, present as if the experiences you read in Sanctuary are connected to her own upbringing. When she was surrounded by a European influence and at the time a Caribbean influence, when was she actually around a southern dialect as a child? There's southern dialect at Fisk University, but that's at the university level. You're not going to see the way Jim Hammer and Annie Poole speak in Sanctuary. You won't see that at the college level. These are likely uneducated people. So when was she ever exposed to something like that? And then issue number 4, because of Larsen's desire to make it as an author and her departure from what she knows, it is possible that she plagiarized Mrs. Addis. However, both Kay Smith and Larsen can be accused of plagiarizing folklore. Their individual narratives did not originate with them. They were open source. So open source is a sort of like a term that we use today, but they were available media. So the same Hockman is saying that Larsen um, was well aware of Sheila K. Smith's work, and so therefore she plagiarized it, or she alludes to that. Well, Sheila K. Smith was aware of another person's work, and so then she must have plagiarized as well. And so but their individual narratives, they both proved Larsen and Sheila K. Smith that their individual narratives did not originate with them. So then you have to make your discussion balanced. And so these are the works consulted. Um, this is Introduction to Modernism, Nella Larsen's Sanctuary, Harlem Renaissance in two places, Harlem Race Riot. And then the journal article is only available as a PDF in the classroom. It's not available. It's one of those purchased items, or with me being a faculty member, I only have access to it. And so when you upload it, it's uploaded in the classroom, and so you should be able to have access to it. In the journal article, plagiarism and unethical practices. So don't forget Jim Crow, Britannica Jim Crow information, Jim Crow laws, Spanish American War, glossary of literary terms, point of view, entry for Plessy v. Ferguson, Separate Car Act, Emancipation Proclamation, and then the causes and effects of the American Civil War. All right, so here, Nella Larsen resources. There is a Britannica entry, Nella Larsen, American author. Bibliography, there are a lot of bibliography works on Nella Larsen. So there's a JSTOR, which requires a subscription. And then there's Oxford Bibliographies, what you can get some information about, and then but it's going to be restricted after a certain time. Then you have primary and secondary works. This is a site that I think that has a lot more information. And then there's a biography, which is usually in the form of a library guide. So these are Nella Larsen um, resources. All right, this is the end of the lecture. Thank you very much for listening.